Hi folks, and welcome to Open Analysis Live. We're live in 2020. I'm Sergey. I'm one half of the team here.
And I'm Sean. I'm usually behind the scenes, but I wanted to say hi and introduce our special project.
So if you guys follow us on Twitter, you probably already know that we finally released our special project, and it is an automated unpacking service. So if you want to check it out, you can go over to UnpacMe. It's unpack.me. The link is here. And check it out. It's free to register. There's no registration code anymore. You just have to sign up and you can start using it right away. As many of you know, this has been a long time in the making, and this is just a beta that we've released, so there's lots of bugs, but it is working okay. And what I want to do today is I want to take you through how it all works, how we built it, why we built it, what are some of the pros and cons, and what are some of the features that we want to release later on. So if you want to learn how it works, since this is a tutorial channel, stick around and I'm going to tell you. So before we jump into how the unpacking actually works, I think it's worthwhile just mentioning a little bit about how automation has changed the reverse engineering landscape and how we sort of, our perspective on it. So reverse engineering software has not been around for very long in the grand scheme of things. And it's evolved quite a bit over my lifetime. So I've been reverse engineering for quite a while, over 5 years professionally doing it every day, and about 10 years doing it as a hobby on and off. So I've sort of watched it grow up. And there's this sort of evolution that I've noticed here that you can see. So when I was first starting out, usually the way that I would approach a reverse engineering problem is I would think of it in terms of like a binary, in terms of could I do it or could I not? Would I succeed or fail? And there's no sort of in-between intermediate ground. It's basically I would try and reverse engineer something. I would fail, have to go learn a whole bunch, come back, and then finally I would succeed. And so it's sort of like a on-off type situation for me. Obviously, that doesn't really work in a professional environment. That's not how things work. And as I sort of matured a little bit, I realized that reverse engineering is really similar to software development in that it's really just a function of time. So the amount of time you put into something versus the amount of work that you get out of it. And so we have this sort of relationship between as you improve as a reverse engineer, you need to put less time in order to get more work out, in order to achieve your goal faster. When you're just starting out, you put in a lot more time to get less work out, but it's always a gradient. And really, unless we're talking about something that's like encrypted, pretty much everything can be reverse engineered. Unless we're actually talking about encryption. It's really just a function of time. And so when you say that something is hard to reverse engineer, really what you're saying is you have to dedicate a lot of time to it. You're not saying that it can't be done. And this pretty much goes for everything. There's certain problems that we would say are impossible to reverse engineer, and it's not that they're impossible, it's just that they take more time than it's worth to actually invest in it. There has to be some sort of good reward at the end for you to invest that much time. So with that in mind, I want to talk about how automation has sort of changed the game. So at least within, I'd say the last 5 years since I've been doing this professionally, automation has completely changed how we approach reverse engineering. And it's sort of the same idea as that approach to professional reverse engineering, where it's not trying to solve the reverse engineering problems for you. So it's not going to do the hard stuff for you. You can't just automate a reverse engineering problem away. That's not how it works. What it does do is it gives you time back for the easy stuff. So what you can do is you can basically automate away a lot of the easy, small stuff that you would have to do normally because it's repeatable and simple. And then that gives you time back to focus on, like human time back, analyst time back, to focus on the hard stuff. So that's really where automation has been making huge gains in this industry. And that's also where we've sort of focused our unpacking project. So we don't really care about hard stuff. We're not trying to do any crazy unpacking. All we're trying to do is cover as much of the easy stuff as possible. And that's sort of the approach that we had when we were going into this. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about terminology. It's going to be important going forward. These aren't necessarily industry standard terms. This is just the way that I'm going to use the terms today, so don't shoot me if you disagree. It's just the way that I'm using them. So in order to define what a packer is, we want to talk a little bit about what isn't a packer. So we're not going to talk about obfuscation. So obfuscation will be where you have where you can't separate the payload from the packer, where they are intertwined and non-separable. So something like VM Protect, where the payload is changed in a unidirectional manner, so you cannot change it back to get the original format. You could get a format that's easier to reverse engineer or easier to understand, but you can't get the original payload back. Those are what we consider obfuscators or virtual machines, and those aren't things that we care about for the purpose of this unpacking tutorial. And it's also important to make a distinction between polymorphic malware and polymorphic stubs. So around 2008, I think Chet Hosmer had a talk at BlackHat about polymorphic and metamorphic malware. And after this talk, basically all these for sale packers started calling their packers polymorphic for whatever marketing purposes. But we want to make a distinction here. When we talk about polymorphic malware, we're talking about the payload is actually changing. So each time you compile the payload, it'll actually change its format. And a good example of this would be something like Dridex, where they have a custom strings library and a custom API library, and each time you compile the sample, even if it's an identical sample, it will look different. The code will look different because it will be obfuscated by these special libraries. That's polymorphic malware. So polymorphic stub is different. What that means is the actual code on disk when your sample is packed looks different each time you pack it. So this means that the malware on disk may look different each time, but if the payload, once you extract it, is identical, we don't consider that polymorphic malware. We just consider that a polymorphic packer. So it's important to make those distinctions. I see those two conflated a lot when people are writing these malware reports, and I just want to make that clear about what we're talking about. And also, it's important to note that I understand that there is a difference, or you can make a distinction between a cryptor and a packer. So cryptor meaning that they're actually encrypting the payload in some way, and a packer meaning that they're simply compressing the payload. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to use cryptor and packer interchangeably. So it means packed or encrypted payloads, the same thing. So don't at me on that. I'm just gonna use that terminology for this tutorial. So before we start talking about our journey to building some automated unpacking, I want to talk a little bit about Packer Basics. So this is basically a reference model that you can use, the simplest packer imaginable. And I want to show the distinction between what the packer looks like on disk and what it looks like in runtime. So on disk, you have three components, roughly three components. You have the stub, which is the actual code that exists on disk that could be decompiled and read. So this is actual code. It's not obfuscated. This is what's used to actually launch the packer, and this is usually what signatures are written against and stuff like that. So you can see that by changing the stub, you can change the way that the payload looks. The second part is the unpacking code. So this is what's responsible for actually decrypting or decompressing the payload, injecting it into memory, and then executing it. And depending on the complexity of the packer, the unpacking code can be part of the stub. So like in the case of something like UPX, where the unpacking code is the stub, or in more complex packers, it can be hidden in multiple stages. So you could have one stage that unpacks another stage, that unpacks another stage, that finally unpacks the payload. And then the third part is the actual payload itself, which is compressed or encrypted on disk, and it's not recognizable as code on disk. So that's where you get your obfuscation from, or your packing from. At runtime, each one of these stages needs to be executed, obviously. So that means that at runtime, each stage will be separate in process memory at some point. And so you can see just by looking at this that obviously one of these formats is easier to attack than the other. So we usually like to look at its memory map format, not its format on disk. So when we talk about unpacking, and this is the way that the packer itself does the unpacking. So this is not how you attack it. This is just how they actually operate. So the first stage is you have to execute the unpacking code. So like I said, sometimes that's actually part of the stub itself, and sometimes it's multiple stages later. Then the unpacking code will deobfuscate or decrypt the payload itself. They'll prepare that payload for injection into memory and execution, and then they'll actually execute it. It's important to differentiate those two last steps because those actually determine how you can detect the packer, which we're going to talk about in depth in a minute. It's also important to note that those last two steps are where a lot of anti-analysis research has gone in on the packer side of things. So a lot of work has gone into trying to hide these steps for packer developers. So now let's talk about the evolution of packers, what they were before and what they are today, and how we got here. So there's basically two market forces that are driving packer evolution. So the first is to prevent reverse engineering, which was sort of the original reason for packing. I guess the original reason was to make your payload smaller, but also to prevent reverse engineering. That's how this sort of started. So usually these packers are detectable, so they aren't trying to hide the fact that they're packed samples. And in some cases, as I'm going to show you, the packers are proud of who they are. They put their signature for the packer in the actual stub, so you can easily detect them. They're usually difficult to unpack, and but that, I mean, they take a lot of time, and that's because they are designed to be difficult to unpack by reverse engineers. Their purpose is to prevent you from reverse engineering the software, and they're almost always dual use. So they're used to protect legitimate software, and also in some cases to protect malware. So that's sort of how packing started. And then what came a little bit later was packers that are dedicated for malware, and these are used to evade antivirus. So their unique characteristics are the fact that they do not want to be identified as packed. So they go out of their way to generate unique stubs that look like regular software. So they're not trying to look like packers. They usually have built-in like environment checks, anti-analysis checks, and these are a little bit different because they're trying to prevent automated analysis versus the reverse engineering prevention ones, which are trying to prevent human analysis. And the antivirus evasion ones are usually simple to unpack, and I'm going to talk about why this is in a second. It's very interesting. There's some market forces here at work that sort of force them into a corner. So those are the two driving forces that we saw pushing the development of packers. And I want to talk a little bit about the actual evolution. But before we do, I want to mention that we don't care about the ones that stop you from reverse engineering stuff. So we've run this channel for a while, and we get a lot of requests asking us to unpack games or unpack, commercial software. That's not what we're interested in at all. So that first case where packers are used to protect software, we're not interested in that. And in fact, as I'm going to show you later on, we go out of our way with UnpacMe to avoid unpacking those. So that's not what we're about. We're about unpacking malware. So just a little disclaimer going forward. So short history of unpacking. When these packers sort of started out, I think 1998 was UPX came onto the scene. So that's long before I was working with computers. And again, the original intent here was to prevent reverse engineering of software. So in the battle of the 90s, early 2000s, you had this sort of arms race of people trying to crack software and distribute it for free, and the software developers trying to protect their software. So you had things like Yoda Scripter or AS Protect, which were used to actually protect the software from reverse engineering. So they're trying to stop you from getting free software. And some of the characteristics here is that of these types of packers were that the payload injection wasn't really around, like process injection. So the payload was usually mapped into the packer process itself. So we do what we call self-injection these days. And what they were trying to prevent was they were trying to prevent a human with a debugger. So they weren't really interested in things like sandboxes. Of course, sandboxes weren't around back then, or detecting virtual environments, which again weren't around back then. What they were really interested in doing is preventing a human with OALabs. That's what they wanted to stop, or soft ice back in the day. That's what these things were trying to stop. So that was the main adversary that they were trying to prevent against. And also in the case of some of these packers, like I mentioned, their developers were proud of them, and so they would have their name or some other identifiable information in the stub itself. So for example, with AS Protect, it was known as a very difficult packer to unpack, and so they would actually put AS Protect in the stub. So if you like strings did or you looked at the data, you could see AS Protect. And I guess this was like a way to maybe warn away reverse engineers, tell them not to waste their time on it. Of course, it didn't really work. If you guys read some of those old cracking forums, you can see it's very funny to see this arms race. But things really changed significantly as we sort of move into 2006. These dates are really rough. It could be 2004, 2006, around then. That's why, at least when I first became aware of this sort of stuff happening. So what happened then was e-crime became a huge industry, like a huge criminal industry. If you guys remember, like the early 2000s, just malware blowing out of the internet everywhere. Everyone was getting infected with stuff. People had toolbars like 10,000 lines deep. It was madness. And what this meant for packers was the antivirus industry was trying to get a handle on this, and they were trying to build all these signatures to detect this malware that was coming out of the woodwork. And these packer developers realized like there was a market in developing packers to evade antivirus. And this is where the term FUD sort of came from. So FUD stands for fully undetectable. And these packers were sold as a way to evade antivirus. So you could pack your malware with a packer, and then antivirus wouldn't be able to detect it. This sort of later on led to the rise of injection as another way to hide from antivirus. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And this also led to, like I mentioned before, these polymorphic stub services. So basically, as a way to make your sample look unique each time it was packed, the actual stub on disk would be changed, and that led to the term polymorphic malware or polymorphic cryptors. This time period also led to AV scanning services. So if you guys remember Scan4U, that guy recently got a lot of time in jail. But basically what they are it's like VirusTotal without an internet connection. So they would scan your malware and tell you whether it was detected by AV, but they wouldn't submit the samples back to the AV company so that the AV company couldn't analyze them. So there's a lot of these dark market scanning services that sort of popped up. So during this time, like I said, it was an arms race, and antivirus got pretty good pretty quickly. And so what they started doing is they started doing in-memory scanning and memory hooking and stuff like that instead of just looking at the samples on disk. This happened very quickly, but a lot of the early AV engines weren't very good at this. Or they were slow. And so over time they improved. And as they were improving, the Packer developers had to come up with new ways to get their payloads into memory. And so this led to basically the rise of injection. So you have a couple different injection methods here. So some easy ones would be like the remote thread. So you basically write your malware payload into memory, and then you create a thread to execute it. And the reason why you would do this is because you want that payload running in a process that looks benign so that antivirus won't scan it. And you want to use API calls that the antivirus companies are not looking at. So you use things like create thread, stuff like that, which nowadays is heavily monitored. But at the time, it wasn't as heavily monitored. So these were ways to sort of get around it. You also had process hollowing, which we all know of now. It's probably one of the most famous injection techniques, where you start a process suspended, you hollow out or remove the code in the mapped memory sections, and then you write your own process code in there, your payload code, and then you resume the process. Now, the reason why this was such a good method is because the APIs that you used to do this were pretty benign, right? So you would start a process that was benign, and then you would remove the code using API calls that weren't hooked at the time by antivirus. Again, nowadays this is, sets off alarm bells 3 ways from Sunday, but at the time this was a good way to evade antivirus. And if I think back to like around 2008 or so, when this method became really prevalent, there was basically PE hollowing was the number one way to hide your malware. And we would see, I was working as an incident responder at the time, and we would see samples that would go, months without being detected. They'd have no signatures on disk, and as soon as they did the process hollowing, AV would leave the process alone, and so it would just basically run forever. And this is where you saw things like 2 Explorer processes running. If you guys remember that, you'd be like, why are there 2 Explorer processes running? That didn't make any sense. Or you see like 1,000 service host processes running, and like a bunch of them would be injected into. So this was, again, AV nowadays really good at catching this, but at the time this was a very useful technique. Once that technique was sort of identified, they got even more clever. So AV started to look at things like how memory was being executed. So what the malware developers did was they would actually halt threads, replace the memory, and then resume the thread. So now you didn't have to actually create the thread, you would just be resuming a thread, which is an API call that's called a lot more often, so it usually wasn't hooked by AV. And so this was another technique that was used for quite a while and was pretty successful. So those are the main ways to do injection. There's also some other ways that came along. So more recently we had like the APC attack, which was called atom bombing. And then we had like the doppelganger attack, which is even more recent. These are good, novel techniques to do injection. The reason why we have Picard face bombing is because they were really overblown. Even though they were really novel and interesting techniques, they just were used by 1% of the malware out there. Almost none of the malware used it. So from an unpacking at scale perspective, we don't really care about this. So even though they were cool, they're just not widely adopted. At the same time, you saw things like VM Protect and Orions, which is the Themida developers. They really got their act together during this time, and they sort of moved from this gray market area to just doing straight up commercial protection software. So you saw almost no malware being protected with it, and you also saw their protections get really good. So like earlier versions of Themida and VM Protect are pretty easy to unpack. Once they got into doing proper VM obfuscation, it became very time intensive to actually unpack stuff with it that was packed with these packers. And of course, we have to mention the rise of installers. So as this arms race was sort of pushing the market for antivirus evasion packers forward, one of the things that malware developers realized was that installers were actually a really good way to hide their malware. This is because installers were used for valid software, so AV couldn't just blacklist them. They had to actually look at what was in the contents of them. And installers had many, many different ways to actually execute and install software. So you use like a script they called a PE, they called a script, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really hard for AV to get a handle on it. They'd have to emulate it for a long period of time, or they'd have to write really good static extractors that had good concepts of the different components. So this sort of became a huge problem, like auto IT. If you guys are doing any triaging now, you know that that's still a problem. It's still a real pain when you see an auto IT sample. Just because there's so many different ways that they can hide the code in it. So this also became a sort of prevalent packer, even though it's not a real packer, but it's worth mentioning. So all that brings us up to today when we have the commodity packer EndGame. So this is what we have today, and it is crazy. So this is one of the number one driving forces of why we built our scalable unpacker, is because of this. So traditionally, if you are selling a packer for antivirus evasion, your model would be to sell or give away the actual packer, and then you would sell a service that gave people clean stubs. So this is the code on disk, so that the stub wouldn't be identified by antivirus. And so you would sell them a service of stubs. This is sort of the next level of it, and this is a real service. This is just one of many that exists online. And the way it works is they have an API, and you upload your payload to the API, and then you just call the API for fully undetectable samples. So every time you call that API, it's supposed to give you back an undetectable sample. And you just basically pay them on how often you want that sample refreshed. So if you pay them enough money, they'll just continuously refresh your sample. And each time they refresh it, what they do is they have their own internal sort of scan for you type virus total scanning service, and they ensure that your sample is undetected by the latest AV signature databases. So basically, every time you call that API, you get a guaranteed fully undetectable sample for a certain period of time, right? So it's only guaranteed for however long till the antivirus picks it up. But this is fully automated. So this means that if you are, running a real business and you have the money, you can just download fully undetectable samples all day long from this API, and you don't have to do any sort of manual work. And so this is what we're seeing today with malware. You'll see one sample, one payload is packed with like 100 different packers over the course of a week. And those packers are just continuously churned out as soon as they get detected. You get a new one. So this is no longer a arms race between humans. This is a scale game. And that's why we thought that we needed to, do some automated unpacking. Now, we started this project before this type of service became a reality, but we could sort of see that this was what was happening. And at the time when we started working on this service, these fully undetectable stub services were what was prevalent. So you'd still have these sort of polymorphic packers, but they weren't as crazy or as high volume as what we see today. And if you guys are curious about how this sort of stuff works, all you have to do is look at Emotet. So in a single day, you'll see upwards of 100 different packed samples from Emotet. When you unpack them, they're all the same payload. So they have this sort of polymorphic style automated crypter service that they're running. It's not this one that I'm talking about, but it's a custom one that they run, but it's the same idea. So that's why you're seeing this sort of proliferation of samples, but when you unpack them, you see that they're all the actual same payload. So let's talk a little bit about unpacking. So this whole channel is dedicated mostly to unpacking. So none of this should be new for you guys. Basically, when you're trying to unpack something, there's two different areas that you can target. I had this example where I said that the last two steps where they did the preparing the payload for execution and then executing the payload were the two areas that you want to focus on for unpacking. So here, I'm just breaking this out a little bit so you can see. So if you're talking about targeting when they prepare the payload for execution, what you want to do is you want to look at deobfuscation routines, trying to identify those. You want to look at writing and reading of memory. And you want to look at trying to identify the payload if it ever exists in memory. So that's when it's being prepared for execution. If you want to look at identifying it when it's actually being executed, you set API hooks for things like new process being started, new thread being started, et cetera, et cetera. So again, these are things that we've covered in depth in many of our tutorials, but those are basically the two approaches that you have when you're trying to do unpacking, or the two most common ways. Manual unpacking is really just learning the process and then using debugger with a whole bunch of plugins. So, so this is OALabs from the 2000s with a whole ton of plugins. It's pretty much the same today, right? You guys just use x64 debug with a bunch of plugins. Not much has changed there. So automated unpacking has been like the holy grail for reverse engineers for a long time. And what I've done here is I've sort of compiled a short timeline of how it's evolved. So if we look back at the early 2000s, the way that you automated unpacking was basically you shared your Ollie scripts. So there's this repository here that I've linked that has a whole bunch of different Ollie scripts that you can use to unpack different old packers. So that's how you used to do it. You just basically would run the script in Ollie yourself. Then in 2007 is the first time that I'm aware of somebody trying to build an actual automated scalable unpacking service. So there might be others, but it's the first one that I'm aware of. And this is Val Smith and Danny Quest from Offensive Computing. And they basically had this BlackHat talk where they built something called Saffron. And what it was it was a Pintool, which is basically a dynamic binary instrumentation tool. And it would look for read writes in memory and dump out any sort of executed code that was outside of the PE file. And it was pretty awesome. And this was built all the way back in 2007, right? So this is over 10 years ago that they built this. Now, it wasn't really maintained very well. I couldn't actually find any code for it, so I'm not sure if they ever released it. But they definitely had working samples, and there's a talk on it. You can look at the slides. I'll link them in the description of the video below. So that's the first time that we sort of saw somebody try to build an automated framework for this. And in a couple slides, I'll show you their idea was actually really smart, and it's actually what we use today. So then we move forward to 2009, and we have Volatility, which is a memory analysis framework, which probably most of you are familiar with. This is basically where you take a mem dump, and then you use this Python framework to carve out artifacts from the mem dump. So at the time, in 2009, there was a plugin for Volatility called Malfind, and what it would do is it would carve out all the read-write executable sections from your memory dump, and it could reconstruct a PE file from that. Now, if you remember earlier, I was saying that process hollowing was really popular around this time, and so it turned out this was actually the perfect tool to detect and extract process hollowed malware. So the two fit together super well. And I was working in incident response at the time, and I'd scripted this up so that basically we would take a memory dump and then we'd use volatility with Malfind to extract the payload. And it worked really good. We were able to automate a lot of unpacking with this. This is back in 2009. It was kind of crazy if you think about it. But that's the first time that you had sort of an open source framework that actually worked. It was clunky because you had to script it up. You had to build stuff to, take snapshots and stuff like that. It was a real pain, but it did work. Around the same time, Reversing Labs, who actually have a paid commercial unpacking service, so they obviously are doing something right and have been doing it right for a long time. They released something called Titan Engine, which was basically a programmable debugger that was hardened against detection. And so you could write some code to say dump these breakpoints or whatever, stuff like that. Unfortunately, it was a little bit behind the time. I don't know how many people are using it. I mean, they still maintain it, and there are still some nice projects with it, but it never really caught on because something like volatility was so much easier and faster. And really what it was it was sort of a throwback to these OALabs scripts in the early 2000s. So it would have been really useful back then if you could sort of combine those scripts with Titan Engine. But being released in 2009, things were already moving much beyond that. So we saw then in 2010, Cuckoo was released. So then you had an open source hypervisor controller, so you could actually control VMs. And I know that myself, when you combined Cuckoo with volatility, you basically had an automated unpacker for all those process hollowing samples. It was really awesome and it worked really well. And since then, Cuckoo development has just really taken off. There's lots of different forks of it that do different sort of unpacking at scale, et cetera, et cetera. So that really was sort of a game changer. And that's what people were using as far as I know. It's what I was using when I was doing incident response. And then in 2015, it's worth mentioning that Nick Kano, at the time he was with Bromium, I'm not sure where he's at now, but he's also kind of famous for doing game hacking. A really smart guy. He released something called Packer Attacker, and it was sort of similar to the idea of Saffron, like Danny and Val Smith's read, write, execute dumper, but it had a lot more logic in it. It was a little bit smarter, and I'm going to talk about some of the concepts that we took from them as well. But it was also a DLL that you had to write. It wasn't based on Pintool, but it would basically be injected into malware processes, and then we would sort of try and dump out the payload based on different API calls. That actually project is it's open source and it's still supported as far as I know. And it's also really cool. It's a nice project and I certainly recommend checking it out. And of course, in 2017, we had PECIV from HasherZaid, which is an amazing tool to do a lot of these different techniques, but it's not an automated service. It's just a standalone tool. So you still need a reverse engineer to actually run it manually, set it up, stuff like that. So it's not a full framework, but it's worth mentioning just because it covers so many techniques and it's a really good tool. So again, worth checking out if you're interested in this space. So it was around 2015 that Sean and I first got interested in building an automated unpacker. And you can see this is actually our Evernote. This is a screenshot of our Evernote that we created. We have this shared Evernote in 2015 where we sort of laid out the concepts for what we wanted to do. And the reason why is we were at Hacklu and we watched this talk called Why Johnny Can't Unpack. And it was basically going through all these different reasons that I've just talked about, why unpacking was hard, that sort of thing. And as we were watching this talk, we're looking at each other saying, we already have automated unpacking, right? Like I said, we've been running it as incident responders with Cuckoo for a long time. So we thought, why don't we try and basically take those concepts and make them into something that can work without a human looking at the results. So we want to be able to actually just unpack the payload automatically by itself. So this sort of set us off on a journey. And like I said, around that time, Nick Kano had released Packer Attacker. So we sort of looked at some of his results, and we also looked at the work that Val and Danny Quist had done. So if we look at Val's work here, you have this sort of concept, which is a concept that we still have today, which is that if it executes, it can be unpacked. So obviously, malware needs to run, and when it can run, you can find it, right? And so what they did was they basically had this algorithm where they would track written memory, and then if it was executed, then they would identify it as unpacked code, and then they would dump it out and basically try and reconstruct something out of it. And so they had this very simple algorithm. And like I said, this is what we use today to do memory dumping. You basically just look for memory writes and dump out the memory. It's very simple, and you can do it with any tool you want. It's just what we would today call a memory dumper, but it's very effective. And this is in, again, remember, 2007, which is insane. It's more than 10 years ago. And this still works for a lot of packers. Now, updating on this concept, we had some slides from Nick Kano. So what he did was he basically took this memory dumping to the next level, and he had 3 different packer classes. So the first one here is heap-based. So this would be when you actually inject the payload into yourself and you execute it in your own process. So here he's looking at when memory in your own process is executed. And this is basically just identical to the Valsmith-Danyquist Pintool Unpacker. So this is the exact same methodology. Here, the second one is PE-based packers, and this is where a P section is actually being overwritten. So this is sort of like a UPX style packer. So what he's doing here is he's changing the permissions on all the P sections so that they can't be written to. And then when something tries to write to them, you know, okay, well, they're trying to write unpack code in there, and then you can do some tricks to actually dump it out. So in this case, what he does is he removes the protections. He allows them to write it in and removes execute protections. Once they try to execute it, he knows that's the entry point for the code. So that's the second class. And then the third class is what we all know and love, which is basically run PE style injection. And so here he's looking for any sort of remote memory access. So any sort of write virtual memory or map view of section, which are 2 ways to access remote process memory. So with these 3 classes, I think he said he had like an 80% success rate, and this would have been in 2015. So pretty awesome back then for a system like this. The reason why we didn't really want to build on this is because it's just a DLL. So you still have to take care of the hypervisor stuff, starting VMs, ending VMs, all that sort of stuff. So we figured if we're going to write that, we may as well sort of do it from the ground up and just write some of these classes in themselves. So what we did was we basically took these concepts, these different base classes, and we expanded on them a little bit to cover other corner cases. And we started building our own Unpacker. So when we started out, we were pretty heavily influenced from Valsmith's work and Danyquist, and so we were using Pintool. Pintool is really difficult to develop for, and we quickly abandoned it in favor of Frida, which is another DBI, but you write your code in JavaScript instead of C, so you can change scripts on the fly, and it just makes it a lot easier to develop for. So it's kind of funny, if you check on our GitHub, you can see that we actually released the work that we did with Frida. We have a Frida Unpacker script. It doesn't work for a lot of stuff, but it works for process hollowing. And so it's on our GitHub right now. Now, the thing is, when we were trying to use this in production, it didn't cover all the cases that we wanted. There are some packers that do specific stuff that prevent dumping and stuff like that, and it wasn't robust enough. It was also extremely buggy. So this was a long time ago, and it was under like early development, and it just didn't run well in production. So what we did was we switched it out for something called WinApp which is a Python debugger. It's a Python programmable debugger. And what we did was we basically implemented these different Unpacker classes with the WinApp and we created on top of it a memory dumper, which is just following the same sort of concept as the early Valsmith Danyquist memory dumper, right? So anything that's written to, we dump it. So with these 2 things, we created what we call AMY, which was the very first, we're really into acronyms, really. It was our very first automated malware analysis framework. And we wrapped that up in an API and a database and a bunch of other stuff, and we called that OMAP. And we actually had, for some of you might know this, a early beta release of this, private beta release of this many, many years ago. Unfortunately, it didn't work. So it worked when we were testing our sample malware, but it didn't work when we released it out to some of our friends who just piled on it with hard malware that it couldn't unpack. And what happened was it couldn't scale well. So we were using 1 VM per sample, which is a terrible idea because it costs a lot of money and it doesn't scale as well as you want. And we ended up basically scrapping the whole project after just running it for a little bit of time because it wasn't working and it was costing us tons of money. But we learned something from it, and this is where we get the very first idea for how to build UnpacMe, what is today UnpacMe. So if you look back at those slides that I had for Valsmith and Danyquist and then Nick Kano, there was one thing that was missing from all those slides, which is how do you know when a sample is unpacked? How do you know when to give up or when to try again, et cetera, et cetera? All these systems that were built prior to UnpacMe either relied on a timeout, so they just run for a bit and then time out and be like, I guess it's unpacked, or they would halt on the first execution of injected code. And of course, as we know, many packers don't have a single stage. They have multiple stages, and each one of those stages is injected code. So you would fail on the first stage, right? You would unpack the first stage, and then that's it. Your unpacking would fail. So we realized that there needs to be some way to differentiate between the packed sample, the malware sample, and an intermediate stage. And this is where the genesis for UnpacMe sort of came from. And so what we did was we realized that we need to build some sort of classifier to look at the output from our unpacker and tell us whether it's done or not. And that we can run multiple parallel engines using different techniques. And then when the first one to get the unpacked sample, we just kill the whole process. So that's what UnpacMe is today. So the first thing we did was we built this sort of parallel processing with a classifier. And then we built a bunch of wrapper around it to make it actual UnpacMe that you guys know today. Under the hood, this is what it looks like. So we have a controller that is controlling a bunch of different processes. We run tons of different stuff in parallel. So we have a hypervisor that runs a memory dumper, and it runs a bunch of specific unpacker scripts that need to be run in a virtual environment. So you have basically our sort of old WinApp scripts. We also have static unpackers, things like UPX, which just run with a tool. And we have emulators to do difficult stuff that needs special reconstruction. So we have single-use emulators for that. All of these run in parallel, and they spit all their samples out into what we call the halt checker. And it is basically always checking these samples against a classifier, basically like a simple machine learning classifier. And what that's doing is it's telling us these samples are the samples that are coming from these processes are either versions of the parent sample, intermediate stages, or they're unpacked malware. It doesn't always work, but it works pretty good, as you guys I'm sure will see. And once we identify unpacked malware, we halt the process and return that along with all the different stages that we identified. So that's how it works in a nutshell. And all the processors in here, all the individual parallel processing pipelines, are all just versions of these different tutorials that we've done over the years for you guys. So we have ones that will look at create process internal suspended, so things for like process hollowing. We have ones that will look for self-injection. We'll have ones that look for PE overwrite. So all these different techniques that we've explained over the years, they're just implemented in different streams. So like I said, some of them require heavy emulation. Some of them require to be run in a virtual environment. It depends, it depends on the different samples that we found. But they're all just simple unpacking techniques, all run in parallel. Some of them spit out well-formed PEs, some of them just spit out data that needs to be reconstructed. All of that is done in the halt checker, basically where it's comparing the output to see what's good and what's not. So how does it perform? Pretty good. So that 93% success rate is for our last version. There's a little caveat in there, valid samples only. So I'm going to talk about what invalid samples are in a second. But for valid samples, we're really hitting it on the head here. Doing good. There are challenges though. So because we're using classifiers to basically identify the different stages in the halt state, it needs to be trained up on things that are not x86 code. So intermediate languages like .NET or VB6, it doesn't perform well on. We have some workarounds for it, but it just needs to be trained up, and we need larger data sets for it, so it doesn't perform super well for that. It also doesn't perform super well for obfuscated parent samples, and the reason for this is because if you have an obfuscated child sample that looks like malware, we're able to determine based on how we got that sample whether it's malware or not. But for a parent, we're not always able to determine that. So sometimes you might send it an obfuscated sample that's not packed, and we will mistakenly think that it's packed and try and unpack it, and this causes problems. So that's definitely something that we are looking at, and it just means that we need to improve our classification. Again, it's not, it's just something that's going to happen over time with a bigger data set. Another thing is downloaders versus malware. Downloaders do not look that malicious. It's kind of funny to say that, but downloaders look a lot like other traditional software, so sometimes we don't detect those. we have basically, again, it's a classifier issue. So we need to look into that a little bit more. Right now we don't have 64-bit support, but that's coming soon. That's just another processor pipeline that we need to put in. But again, we don't, this isn't our full-time job, so it takes a while to put these in. And then we have this issue where we have packed malware-looking non-malware. So if you remember back in the very beginning of this tutorial, when I was saying we don't want to unpack packed commercial software, we have like checks in there to do this, but some packed commercial software, especially stuff packed with VM Protect, that is like game software, we'll just run that through our processors anyway, and you'll get some malformed garbage at the end because we end up picking up the wrong outputs when we try and send them to you. So it doesn't work well for that. In that case, I'm not sure if we're ever going to be able to solve that. I think we're still going to probably run into issues where we just have samples that look like malware, but they're not. So again, that's just a classifier issue. So that's basically it. I hope that you guys found this interesting. This represents a lot of years of work for both Sean and myself, and we're pretty excited to actually have this released to you guys. And I would say if there's anyone here who's like interested in automated unpacking, I'm going to leave a whole bunch of links in the description of the video below to our like resource material that we used when we were developing this. And so you can sort of follow along, and if you're interested in looking at it, I think this is a super interesting topic, and we're only going to improve UnpacMe as it goes along. Like you can see, a lot of the challenges have to do with needing a larger data set for better classification. So it's it's basically just going to get better over time. So please use it. Send us those samples so we can improve our classification. And the next video you see from us will be back to our normal tutorials. We have something pretty neat coming up for you guys, talking about string decryption. So until then, keep exposing the mechanics behind the malware. Stay curious.